My name is Rabbi Pinchas Hecht, and I'm the very fortunate head of school at the new Atlanta Jewish Academy. So for those of you who I don't know, please, after we have a little dessert reception afterward, I'd love to meet you and get a chance to answer any questions or speak to you. This morning we're very, very fortunate. I'm actually very excited to see that a good number of our educators from the school are here, and that speaks well about us because of the wonderful topic that relates and is so important to the mission of our institution. This is exactly aligned with who we are and who we'd like to continue to be. This morning we get to hear from someone who's very close to the Atlanta Jewish Academy, one of our previous principals, who I'm told actually saved our high school. So, you know, I don't know what else I could say that tops that. So, you know, thank you very much. I wouldn't have a job here today, if you weren't here. Dr. Berger, as you all know, is a graduate of Princeton, of Columbia. He has many, many books to his name, articles. He's a lead advisor and director at the Avichai Foundation, professor at Emory, rabbi and doctor and a scholar, and really a profound person who is always ready and willing to help me personally. If I call him up with a question, he always takes the time to give it serious thought and give me advice that when I follow it, it turns out to work, and when I don't, it turns out that I needed to, and I will afterward, after making my mistake. He's wise, well beyond his years, and really a tremendous asset to our community that we at the school here hope to take more and more advantage of going forward. We're honored to hear you this morning, and we hope to have many more opportunities to learn from you. Thank you so much, and please.
Wow. I could just step down now. I just want you to know that critical thinking doesn't come from the word crisis. So my experience does not extend to that. Thank you, Rabbi Hecht, for that really wonderful introduction. And I think actually this is a very ideal forum for reflecting on a series of topics that were put together by AJA in its inaugural year. And I'm very excited to be participating in that. When I was asked a couple of months ago about the topic, whatever you would like to talk about relating to critical thinking and Jewish education. And the truth is, I've been thinking about this for many years. I think I've been thinking about this since high school, which is the truth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just as a way in to the subject, and I'm hoping to leave a lot of time for questions and answers because there's no way to tackle the whole subject in the time we have. I just thought by starting off, we would look at a couple of mission statements of Jewish day schools around the country. Okay, so here's Northwest Yeshiva High School. I'm going to start on the top left of the country and just kind of go around. And so it's a yeshiva, it's an Orthodox high school, it's co-educational. And what makes a Northwest Yeshiva high school education so unique? Sophisticated, become increasingly sophisticated thinkers, both critically and creatively. This is in their philosophy of their Jewish studies. In their philosophy of Jewish studies. Moving down the West Coast, Portland Jewish Academy. It's a Rav Sar community day school. Our mission, it's on their mission page. Our dedicated and creative faculty members teach through hands-on experiences to develop critical thinking skills. I apologize for the people who are blocked by this middle podium. Heschel in Los Angeles is a community pre-K through 8, and their mission statement provides a rich dual curricular education that encourages independent and critical thinking. It's like everywhere, right? So swinging around the country, going to Texas, the Robert M. Barron, K through 12, modern Orthodox, coeducational, and this is also in their Jewish philosophy statement. We strike a balance between relevance and reverence, I like that, in our Judaic studies. Using the most up-to-date technologies, our teachers engage the students and ignite their curiosity, textual skills, critical thinking. They just go hand in hand in this mission statement. Okay? Chicagoland, going up into the middle of the country, the Midwest. This is a pluralistic Jewish high school. This is you come to their website, this is what you see. On the very first screen, Chicagoland Jewish High School creates a culture of academic excellence that inspires the students to think critically. It's the first goal of high school teaching, and achieve their potential. Right? This is Schechter in Cleveland, your sort of old stomping ground Rabbi hat. Missions and values, right under their mission statement are core values. After conservative Jewish thought and practice, which is reasonable for Schechter, academic rigor and critical thinking. Second bullet of their core values as a pre-K through 8. And I could not resist this one. Atlanta Jewish Academy, it's the first thing. Critical minds. By the way, I learned the snipping tool. It's so neat. I learned it last night, so it's just really very so I wanted to use it as often as I could. But just as an introduction, you have your outlines in front of you. What I would like to do this morning is to go through some kind of definition of critical thinking. What does it mean? What does it entail? How is it developed? But also some of its history. It is an evolving notion. Discuss the aims of education, generally speaking, and what role critical thinking plays in that, or roles. What are the goals of Jewish education? Because after all, the aim here is to understand how it fits into Jewish education, and what would be the role of critical thinking, and then some concluding remarks. So that's how I'd like to build it. Start with the critical thinking, talk about education generally, then talk about Jewish education, and then conclude. So critical thinking as a notion actually starts with the Greeks. So it's not a new notion, it's 2,500 years old. Socrates is most famous in his Apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. And that doesn't mean, I know this is a Jewish community, it doesn't mean examining other people's lives. It's actually examining. We're experts at that. We've been doing that for 3,500 years. The unexamined life means thinking about what you believe, what you do, how you relate, how you respond. The point is to be a knee-jerk, automatic, reflexive kind of human being, for the Greeks, was considered an immature, you're not a full person, according to the Greeks. Right? We need to understand that, because we've dropped a lot of that in the modern period, but they came at the world what we call teleologically, that there were goals to everything. And I don't mean sign up for your goals. I don't mean like meet a counselor and figure out your goals. That's what we do today. We're talking about to be a human, by definition, means to strive to be rational. And if you don't, you're not a complete person. And that's hard for us to understand. And definitionally, to be human means to develop your rational capacities. Otherwise, how are you unique from animals? So for the Greeks, if you didn't develop this, I mean, we could feel bad for you, that we could do, but fulfilling your being, fulfilling your, not role, but rather who you are, you required a lot of work. And so for Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. It's not because, oh, I feel bad for those poor people who are not examining their life. It's because that's what human life is. Because it's not animal life, it's human life. And to be human means to be reflective about what you do, how you arrive at your conclusions, how you go from that to other things. So as we know, Socrates was forced to drink hemlock, but it's his method that was laid out really in the Platonic dialogues that lays out the elements that everybody would nowadays agrees are part of critical thinking. I'll just go through them. These are not surprising to anybody in with a college education. Socratic method says you have to ask deep, probing questions. Profoundly inquiring the nature of ideas, where they come from, what they entail, what they mean, in order to be worthy of our belief. We don't just simply take something because it's been uttered, but we have to think about it. Socrates says you have to seek evidence. He would love getting into dialogues with people, say, well, why do you say that? Where does that come from? Based on what did you arrive at that conclusion? So seeking evidence. He was really great, and they're masters at this in law schools, closely examining reasoning and assumptions, hypotheticals. So let's take your reasoning. Well, if this were the case, what would you say? Well, that means your assumption is the following. And really teasing out the elements of good thinking according to Socrates. So it's not just that what is good reasoning. Is this an example of good reasoning? Could it be better? What are the faults in it? And of course the assumptions. Analyzing basic concepts. We are great at dropping terms and words in all our conversations. When you read things, Socrates would say, well, what do you mean by that? So I said, well, this leads to well-being. What do you mean by well-being? Are you talking physically? Are you talking emotionally? Are you talking intellectually? Interrogating our concepts. Don't take them as givens, but really analyze basic concepts, because everything gets built on those things. So if you don't have a good understanding of what the basic is, how can you develop a theory or a program? And here's the hard part, tracing out the implications of what is said and what is done as well. All right, well, if you do that, what would be the next step? What would you say to somebody who came to you with this? Let's tease out, if you actually did that, what would it look like? If you if you put a law into place, there's a whole area of philosophy called the double effect. It's in ethics, actually. Talk about, okay, so I put this policy into place, but what's going to be the other impact, the ripple effect, not just of the thing itself, but we know that throughout life that we have to anticipate these other kinds of things. And according to Socrates, as a good rationalist, all this needs to be done clearly. Something I struggle with my students with every day at Emory. Write clearly. I understand that, I just can't write it. I said, no, then you don't understand it, I tell them. If you can't write clearly, then you don't think clearly. And with logical consistency, which according to some people is sort of the hobgoblin of weak minds. But the logical consistency was something that was very important to Socrates. So the Socratic method was the ideal of critical thinking, but I want to make sure that you understand it was a tool. Critical thinking was a tool that you applied in various areas of your life. Really, all areas of your life. But you don't say, I'm going to school to learn critical thinking. Like that's not, you don't get a degree in critical thinking. You use critical thinking in different areas of your life. And that's what Socrates will do. In fact, the Socratic dialogues are, in very many cases, investigations of law, of governance, etc. Well, the Middle Ages, I found that fun. I should have called this exploratory because I've discovered so much. So in the Middle Ages, they continued with the analysis using Socratic methods, but it was primarily to sort out weak or faulty arguments from good ones. It was a sorting tool. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, there was a equally valid source of truth. It's the Middle Ages, right? Revelation, church fathers, scripture, right? This was just as important to them. In fact, it was impossible to imagine that there was only one source of truth. So you had people, I wrote it on the bottom, Aquinas' Summa Theologia is the classic example in Latin. every section, and it goes on for many volumes, every section is, we know this, and it talks about perhaps a philosophical idea, but it says in Scripture, or it says in one of the church fathers, and that seems to be inconsistent. So we have to reconcile. So in the Middle Ages, critical thinking was primarily engaged in to reconcile what seemed to be different sources of truth that looked like a contradiction. Right? Systematization was another critical element. Socrates never put together a grand system of the nature of being, the nature of human, of action, of ethics. It doesn't cross it all. He has really individual dialogues. But in the Middle Ages, grand systems that put it all together, that made it all fit neatly one into the other, that was one of the goals, to build these edifices. And I would say the Rambam's Guide to the Perplexed is a similar effort at he's a great systematizer. One of the first, actually, who thoroughly does it in the Jewish tradition. And that means epistemology. What can we know that would be valid? Ontology, the nature of being. What does it mean to be human? The nature of inquiry, the nature of society. These are big questions. And in the Middle Ages, they said, now that we actually run society, the Christians, and the Muslims said, now that we run society, we have to have a totalizing understanding of how all the pieces fit in. So one of the interesting things why the Rambam was the first, because Jews didn't run society. They didn't even run their own society. It was just very interesting. But the Christians said, now that we have it all, we're controlling all, how do all the pieces fit? And as I mentioned earlier, the reconciliation of the various truth claims that are Scripture and revelation together with truth, because God was the source of natural law and thinking and our minds, but God is the source of Scripture. So if God is the source of both, how could there be any discrepancy? How could there be internal contradiction and inconsistency when the source of truth is the same? So that was the Middle Ages. But we in the West have been heirs to a very different history since the Renaissance. And there's a reason that I'm going through this, so please be patient with me. And I'm sorry that at AJA the clock is so far away that I can't see it, but there is a little clock here that Sue put up so that I can see what's going on. The Renaissance begins to sort out, really already before the Reformation, with early reformers like Erasmus. We have to not rely on authority for truth. We actually have to rely on critical thinking. Remember that sorting function of the faulty? Well, let's take that further. So just because the Pope said it, does that make it true? Just because somebody in the 3rd century said it, does that make it true? And there are claims that we're running into sort of a block when it came to the other developing sciences. And there was clear inconsistencies that could not be reconciled. Actually, Aquinas, in the 1200s, he's the end of the great systematizers. When you think about it, the scholastic movement, which I won't go into, which was dominant in Europe and in the universities, its heyday was the 1200s. By the 1300s, people were starting to chip away at this big system. Does it really account for everything? We need evidence. We need reason. We don't need authority. We don't need people to just tell us what's true. We kind of have to figure it out on our own. And it's a remarkable revolution that doesn't happen overnight. It takes centuries as different areas fall, if you will, to increasing critical inquiry. How do we know what we know? How can we rely on it to be true? Some of it is happening within the church. The great canon law collections, but then later on, what do we have notions of rights from? Where did we get a right from? What is the power of government? Where did that come from? People are starting to reflect on it, and they don't want to say, because that's the way we do it. That's really not persuasive. I mean, it's persuasive to the people in power. But the people who aren't in power, tell me why. I'm so tempted to think of that Monty Python skit with the basis for government, coming out of the aquatic nymphs coming out and giving swords out is not a basis of legitimate government. But legitimacy and authority don't come from power, they come from critical thinking, and you have to prove it to me. Science is the one that takes the longest, but also is the most compelling, because I mean, I know we have great science teachers in the room here, and you just start going from really right at the end of the Renaissance, but into the Enlightenment. You have in every area of science, of biology, of chemistry, turning over a Copernicus, like Ptolemaic, I can't say solar system, Ptolemaic universe was just accepted for centuries. I'm teaching the Rambam Shabbat afternoon, and he talks about these philosophers that base their theories on these crazy ideas, like there are things called atoms, because everybody knows that's wrong. It's like, yes, in the 1100s that was wrong. So no, you have to prove to me why I should believe in your approach. The earth is not necessarily the center. What's the evidence? Right? Reason is separate from evidence, but they're related. But science, chemistry, obviously physics, mathematics is developing further. Biology, how the human body works. It's being uncovered slowly, gradually, but it's falling to the Galen's medicine, which was like 1,500 years old, almost 2,000 years old. People are saying, you know what, it's not that way. I mean, we think about it, but it took centuries to come up with the concept of circulation. They knew there was a heart. I mean, they dissected people. They knew that there were hearts. I mean, dissected, they usually cut them with swords, and they discovered, oh, there's a heart there. But they didn't understand that it was a transport system, that it was, right, there was no notion of breathing, that the pulmonary is connected to the cardio. It's amazing that this just takes a while. But science is not based on authority at all, but built on the bottom-up. Newton's laws of physics, the three fundamental laws of physics. It's just a totally new way. Politics. You have Locke's treatise on government. What's legitimacy? Hobbes' Leviathan. Well, how do people give up their rights to a ruler? How does that happen? The notion of covenant and contract. These are basic ideas that the Enlightenment is saying is based on critical thinking and not authority. Economics, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Right? Marx, granted it's the 1800s, but Karl Marx, he's an economics philosopher. He and Engels are really trying to understand the nature of labor and capital and management, and it's critical thinking is the way that they develop their theories. What is the nature of society? What do we do as individuals? What do we do as collectives? The old Greek notion of what is the goal of society to enable individual flourishing, we get that in the Enlightenment. What's the reason we have government in our society? In America, what's the purpose of the Constitution? It's not to collect taxes. I just want you to know. It's not. It's in order to, like, individual pursuit. That the goal of society is to help the individual get to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A very different notion of happiness. It really doesn't mean tonight's game. It's not happiness. That might make some people happy, but and then finally, religion. That religion is subject to critical thinking. That we're not going to accept things based strictly on the authority of popes or bishops or ancient texts. The Reformation could not have happened if there wasn't critical thinking going on in the Renaissance. But then even after that, there are people who are attacking. You have David Hume's devastating critique of religion, from which I think the West has never fully recovered. Kant Kant writes in the 1760s, religion within the limits of reason alone. Just think about that term. Religion within the limits of reason alone. Build religion up from the bottom. Don't just tell me it was revealed. Okay? It's just a fascinating idea, and we're all heirs of that in the West. There is another element that became more essential in the 19th and 20th centuries, which was the push for critical thinking is not just for philosophers in universities to think about or to write treatises on. You have to act on your critical thinking. Critical thinking is meant to be normative. It's fine when the people philosophize about the nature of government and they come up with representative forms of government, but actually individual, you have to develop as a critical thinker because that's going to dictate how you're going to choose to live your life. And I don't mean just overall. I'm talking about what am I doing today? Like, you have to develop a critical posture so that I'm not just going to do the same thing. I'm not going to just be on the treadmill. Well, maybe you should be on the treadmill. But I mean on the treadmill of, oh, it's 8 o'clock, get up, get dressed, go to work. Right? That, you have to engage life. Socrates' notion of living the unexamined life as being not worth it is a critique of just Western society. You have to actually develop a decision-making process, not just in theory, but in practice. Now, obviously, we weren't following all that, because in 1980, the Foundation for Critical Thinking is founded. Well, if we're so Western and we're such critical thinkers, then why would you have to start a foundation? By the way, their 35th conference is coming up in a couple of months, if you want to go. It's their 35th. They say it's the only non-academics conference, meaning not a university kind of conference, focused on critical thinking. Ralph Nader is a frequent speaker at this, and they have a second part of it. It's the critical thinking community. They want that, so now you're part of a community, and they have an amazing website. You can really get all that you want about critical thinking. They've even added things, they admit, in light of some stuff that I'm going to bring up later in the presentation. But they see schools as critical to that. And I would like to now turn, to sum up sort of what the critical thinker does, and then we're going to turn to education. So the critical thinker questions and probes ends and objectives, the status and wording of questions. Like, how did you say that? What did you mean by that? Really sharpening it, refining it. All of you English teachers out there, getting students to write clearly and precisely. Sources of information and fact. Oh boy, are we struggling with this one. Well, I got it from the web. Right? It must be true. Or I saw it on Facebook. And that's your second source of... No, I actually now regularly for my students, I give them a daily assignment. They must put down their sources. I said, you have to find at least 2 or 3 sources for where you got it from and come up with a composite definition. I just do this regularly now because I want to see where they're getting it from. It's always web. I point out, there is something called the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You might want to check it out and things like that. But sources of information and fact. And I'm sorry to say, I know we have a journalist in the audience, but no, our journalistic media have not contributed well to this lack of faith in our sources of information and fact. The method and quality of information collection, where did you pick that up? How did you get it? How many people did you interview? Did you investigate? Did you question? So it's not just, oh, well, I asked 3 people. Whoa, how did you ask them? Did you ask them in a leading way? Right. It's the quality of information. The mode of judgment and reasoning used. It's not just enough to say, I thought about it, and this is what I concluded. No. How did you think about it? What questions did you ask, etc.? The concepts that make that reasoning possible, underlying that's the idea a fortiori reasoning, or different things about logic, A or not A, and things like that. The assumptions that underlie concepts in use acknowledge that there are underlying assumptions, and the implications that follow from their use, which we brought up. So these are the goals of the tools in education. I want to just take for a moment, what do you think the aims of education are? Generally. Yeah, this is an interactive part. Huh? Impart information. So that would so I could read things, but I could also go to school and get things. So it's the classic, right? Open the brain, pour it in, close it, right? Sew it up, and now I have the information. That is definitely one. Dan?
Impart the need for learning and where to find the information.
Okay, so now you're talking about a skill, but also curiosity. In other words, this idea to need to continue to be, I didn't do that one. Ongoing learning is a frequent one on mission statements.
Purposes of education.
Alan, yes?
And this was said by some Greek guy, I guess now.
Some Greek guy.
Not to fill a vessel, but like fire. Vessel.
So now we realize that because, and this is going to be key, when the Greeks wrote about education, by the way, Francis Bacon wrote about education in the late Renaissance, so it's not like, I'm really sorry. So people have been talking about education, but when they talk about education, they never said, like K through 12 schools. That's not, that concept of education, lifelong. So we realized that this idea, and I know even at Emory, we think about, oh my gosh, if we don't talk about it now, like when will they hear this? And I know what elementary schools must think about, like wow, if we don't tell them now, where will they ever hear this or know about it? Even if developmentally they're not ready for it. It's a big problem. But when Socrates thought about education, he thought about it as a lifelong thing. You would have a mentor or you would have friends. Aristotle's notion of friendship is really around ongoing values and learning from one another. Friendship is very key to Aristotle's notion of the flourishing life. And I don't mean friendship as in having friends. I mean, it's that what the friends do with you, right? Tailgating not being one of them. I guess I'm just going to use that metaphor all day. So the idea that you mentioned is part of it, and the Greeks, but they didn't limit it to, when we say the goals of education, what do we really mean? The goals of schooling. There's a big difference. And we have to acknowledge that schools can do certain things, but they can't do it all. But the aims of education itself are something that have undergone a lot of reflection. And I'm just going to, this is a book that I found really fascinating by Clayton Christensen. He is actually a great professor at Harvard who developed theories of disruptive innovation. And that was his main thing. And somebody asked him, well, what about schools? Why can't we have disruptive innovation in schools? And he wrote this book, I think in 2006 or 2008. And he predicted that by 2016, a certain percentage of students in high school would be getting their courses online and the disruption involved in that. But the real problem with disruptive innovation is that disruptive innovation always takes place outside the structures of business. It's the startups that are doing the innovation, and then it leaks back in, and this is why Dell falls or IBM. Things like that happen. It's a very worthwhile book. But in his second chapter, he goes through the 4 phases of phases of the goals of education in America. And the reason I'm focusing on this is because we live in America, and you should be aware that it's changed. So initially, before 1900, the major goal of public education, and even though we didn't have public education throughout the country, people like Thomas Jefferson were imagining it. Thomas Jefferson was the one who came up with the idea of elementary school, high school, and college. That there should be 3 phases, and because he was worried about the elite. He was actually very worried about a tyranny of the masses, but he felt you would have 3 tiers with fewer and fewer students going through the sections. It wasn't put into place till much later. We're talking about the one-room schoolhouse for most of America. The one-room schoolhouse. But there the goal was that to preserve American democracy, you needed an educated citizenry. Does that make sense? They have to read. They have to study. What? They have to study the claims that are being made about the promises of politicians, the wisdom of laws. You can't just rely on charisma. They were very worried that America would fall back into a tyranny like Europe. So reading was very important. The skills of reading were paramount. So you could have the schoolhouse because the older ones would teach the younger ones how to. But as long as you could provide books to people, there was a trust that they would be able to develop the thinking around the reading. We all know the famous stories of Abraham Lincoln, whatever. But the other thing with civics was very important. Democratic values. We have to read John Locke. We have to read some of the main theories of freedom and individual flourishing. It's not enough to just read popular writing. There was popular writing, but that would be a waste of time when you grow up. In the schoolhouse, we have the importance of freedoms to prevent government from encroaching on them. That was up till 1900. But then Clayton Christensen claims that starting in the very late 1800s, early 1900s, there was an awareness that America is booming economically, industrialization. We now need a workforce. And we need a very sound workforce because we need everybody to be employed. Full employment was a goal of the country, and all these immigrants needed to be trained, and that's an important word. Now education is not about personal flourishing. What is it about? Or civics? It's about finding a job, being trained to do something, to not... Remember, that we don't have a concept yet of welfare. If you can't work, you will be a burden on somebody, and that you can't be an individual who could succeed in life. So, as Christensen points out, they didn't say don't do this, they said do this and do this. And this is the period where high schools expanded. The number of high schools grew exponentially. This number of students in, I have it here, I wrote down, that the number of, yes, in 1905, 1/3 of students went on to high school. By 1930, 75% went on to high school. You realize that in 25 years, right, more than doubled. And now you have all these immigrant children coming up for high school. High schools had to change. So you started to create tracks in high school, vocational. That's when you started to have shop, and you started to have art, and because people, the goal was everybody should be employed. Whereas the schoolhouse was just get them to read and actually to do basic math and penmanship and some basic critical thinking skills. Now it's a sound workforce. And the 50s and 60s, when there's wealth and there's affluence, there's even more opportunities. There's orchestra and band, right? It's like all these things start to happen because of this concept of everybody should be gainfully employed as adults. Now, welfare does change that to a certain degree because there's a safety net for people who don't get a job. But before that, there is this sense of variety and diversity within the high school program, and that's when you start to get these 1,000-student high schools. You didn't have that before. You didn't need it, but now you do. So that was the second phase. That's when you start to get APs, the advanced placement. Right? You start to have all of this languages come in, art, photography. The reason this is a key point, 1980, is that in 1981, a study was put out by the Department of Education, A Nation at Risk. It just sent everybody into a tailspin, that the core subjects are not being learned. There's all this, so they come out knowing how to go do auto body work, but they can't spell. So how can we be competitive? And there was a fear that Europe, Japan, you remember when Japan was the big threat on the economic landscape? But keeping America competitive, and it was a focus on the basic skills, but how are you going to know? What's your evidence that there's progress? Metrics. We need more tests. we need more standardized tests, and we need to measure how the students are doing. And that explodes in the 1980s to ETS's Great Satisfaction, Educational Testing Service. And that is a primary goal, and it leads to the final phase, which is the No Child Left Behind.